The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling railroad camp outside Cheyenne as Henry Anderson studied the surveyor's maps spread across his makeshift desk. As chief construction supervisor for the Western Pacific Railroad, he'd overseen dozens of track installations, but something about these latest route plans troubled him. The proposed line cut directly through a valley that local tribes had specifically warned was sacred ground, though the company's official surveys conveniently omitted any mention of burial sites. Wiping sweat from his brow, Henry stepped out of his tent into the crisp autumn air. The camp sprawled along the banks of the North Platte River, where nearly 200 workers toiled to extend the iron rails ever westward. The steady rhythm of hammers, striking spikes mixed with shouts, and the snorting of draft horses. In the distance, smoke from the Cheyenne rail yard drifted lazily across the Wyoming sky. Frank Taylor, Henry's assistant supervisor, approached with an anxious expression that immediately set Henry on edge. "Mr. Anderson, sir, we've got trouble with some of the local tribes again. Their representatives are demanding to speak with you about the route through Thunder Valley. Says it's hallowed ground or some such nonsense." Frank's dismissive tone made Henry's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "Those representatives have names, Frank, and legitimate concerns." Henry gathered his coat and hat, already knowing this confrontation had been inevitable. He'd spent the past month trying to convince the company's board in Chicago to consider alternate routes, but his telegrams had gone conspicuously unanswered. The whole situation felt orchestrated, though he couldn't yet prove it. At the edge of camp, 3 Native American elders waited stoically beside their horses. Henry recognized Daniel Walker, a mixed-blood translator who often served as intermediary between the railroad and local tribes. The grave look on Daniel's weathered face confirmed Henry's worst fears about the true nature of the route selection. "Mr. Anderson," Daniel began formally, "the tribal council has sent these respected elders to make a final appeal. The proposed track will desecrate the resting places of their ancestors. Surely another path can be found?" His dark eyes held Henry's steadily, conveying the gravity of the situation. Henry's mind raced as he considered his options. The company had invested heavily in this route, and changing course now would cost dearly in both time and money. But the elder's quiet dignity touched something deep within him, a sense of right and wrong that transcended profit margins and shareholder expectations. That evening, Henry sat alone in his tent, poring over the correspondence from Chicago. Phrases jumped out at him: strategic positioning, inevitable conflict, military contracts, and a disturbing pattern emerged. The company wasn't just being stubborn about the route. They were deliberately provoking confrontation to justify a larger land grab. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Henry called, hastily gathering the incriminating papers. Martha Clark, the camp cook's wife, entered with a steaming cup of coffee. Her kind face showed concern as she set the cup beside him. "You missed supper again, Mr. Anderson. Everything all right?" "Just wrestling with some difficult decisions, Mrs. Clark." Henry managed a tired smile. "Tell me, what do you make of our route through Thunder Valley?" "The local tribes seem mighty upset about it." Martha's expression darkened as she smoothed her apron thoughtfully. "My Robert, he's been hauling supplies through that valley for 20 years now. Says it's full of stone markers and such. Sacred ground, plain as day. Seems to me only a fool or someone with darker motives would put train tracks there." Her words confirmed Henry's growing suspicions. Later that night, unable to sleep, Henry walked to the river's edge. The moon painted silver streaks across the dark water as he contemplated the weight of his discovery. If he exposed the company's scheme, he'd likely lose his position, and with it, the means to support his ailing sister back east. But if he remained silent, he'd be complicit in an atrocity that would haunt him forever. Dawn found Henry composing 2 letters, one to the territorial governor detailing the company's machinations, and another to his sister Margaret in Boston, explaining why her monthly allowance might soon cease. As he wrote, the sound of approaching horses drew his attention. Through the tent flap, he glimpsed Charlie Moore, the company's regional director, riding into camp with an armed escort. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than expected. Henry quickly sealed the letters and summoned Daniel Walker's son, a swift young rider who often carried messages to Cheyenne. The boy's eyes widened at Henry's urgency, but he asked no questions as he tucked the letters into his jacket and mounted his pony. Charlie Moore's voice boomed across the camp. "Anderson, get out here! We need to discuss some changes to the construction schedule. Henry squared his shoulders, knowing that his next words would alter not just his own fate, but that of countless others. The truth about Thunder Valley and the company's dark intentions had to come to light, whatever the personal cost. Henry emerged from his tent into the fading light of dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows across the bustling railroad camp. Steam rose from the nearby river where workers were cleaning up after their day's labor, the gentle sound of flowing water a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. Charlie Moore sat astride his bay stallion, flanked by two hired guns whose weathered faces betrayed no emotion. "Evening, Charlie," Henry said evenly, noting how the regional director's usually immaculate suit was covered in trail dust. Something had driven him to ride hard from Cheyenne, and Henry suspected it wasn't good news. The construction schedule was already aggressive. Any acceleration would make it impossible to avoid the sacred grounds they'd discovered last week. Charlie dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. "Got word from corporate. They want us through Thunder Valley by month's end. No detours, no delays." He pulled a folded map from his jacket and thrust it at Henry. "I've marked the new route. We'll need to double the crews and work around the clock." The map confirmed Henry's worst fears. The new route cut straight through the heart of the burial grounds, where weathered wooden totems stood as silent guardians over generations of tribal ancestors. He'd spent the past week carefully surveying an alternative path that would spare the sacred site, but it would add 3 weeks to the schedule and cost the company an additional $50,000. "That's Cheyenne territory, Charlie. They've been peaceful, but if we desecrate their burial grounds, there'll be war." Henry kept his voice low, aware of the workers gathering nearby, their curiosity piqued by the director's unexpected arrival. "The military's just looking for an excuse to move against them. This will give them one." Charlie's face hardened. "That's not our concern, Anderson. The company has investments to protect, schedules to meet. If the savages want to make trouble, the army will handle them." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Besides, I know you've been meeting with that tribal elder, getting soft on us. Remember who pays your salary?" The accusation stung, but Henry thought of Rachel, the elder's daughter, who had shown him the burial grounds and explained their significance. Her people had lived along this river for centuries before the railroad's arrival. The thought of their ancestors' bones being scattered by dynamite and steam shovels made his stomach turn. "I've already sent the survey reports to headquarters," Henry said carefully. "The alternative route is viable. It would save lives, Charlie. Native lives, but also our workers. You know they'll defend their sacred ground." He watched Charlie's expression darken, wondering if the director already knew about the letters he'd just dispatched. A commotion arose from the workers' camp as Daniel Walker burst through the crowd, his face flushed with urgency. "Mr. Anderson, riders spotted coming down from the north. Looks like Army scouts." The timing couldn't have been worse. Henry had hoped to have more time to prevent the powder keg from igniting. Charlie smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Perfect timing. Colonel Robert's been asking about our progress. Now he can see firsthand how these savages are impeding the march of civilization." He turned to his armed escorts. "Make sure those survey reports don't leave camp. And find that boy who just rode out. Bring him back." Henry felt the weight of his Colt revolver against his hip, knowing that soon he might have to choose between his duty to the railroad and the lives of innocent people. The sun had disappeared behind the western hills, leaving the camp in growing darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, he knew Rachel's people were watching, unaware that their worst fears were about to be realized. The lanterns cast long shadows across the makeshift railroad camp as Henry made his way between the canvas tents, his boots crunching on loose gravel. Every worker he passed seemed to sense the tension in the air, conversations dropping to whispers. The distant thunder of hooves grew louder as the Army scouts approached from the northern ridge, kicking up dust that caught the last remnants of twilight. Henry's mind raced through his options. The survey reports in Charlie's tent proved the company had deliberately altered the route to cut through the burial grounds, but getting to them now would be nearly impossible with the armed guards. He thought of Rachel's earnest face when she'd shown him the sacred markers 2 weeks ago, explaining how generations of her people were laid to rest in those hills. The memory of her trust made his current predicament even more bitter. The sound of raised voices drew his attention to the eastern edge of camp. Daniel Walker was being roughly escorted back by 2 of Charlie's men, the young telegraph operator's face streaked with dirt and blood from what looked like a fresh cut above his eye. Henry Anderson wiped sweat from his brow as he studied the survey maps spread across his makeshift desk in the Union Pacific Field Office outside Cheyenne. Something about the proposed route through the Wind River Valley didn't sit right with him. The company's lead surveyor, Frank Taylor, had insisted this was the only viable path for the new rail line, but Henry knew the terrain well enough to spot the deliberate deception. The maps conveniently omitted any mention of the ancient burial grounds that dotted the valley floor, sacred sites that the local Shoshone had carefully documented in their treaties with the government. Henry had seen the stone markers himself during his initial scouting ride, weather-worn monuments that spoke of generations of native history. His stomach churned at the implications of what the railroad seemed to be planning. That evening, as golden light painted the Wyoming sky, Henry rode into Cheyenne to meet his old friend Daniel Clark at the River's Edge Saloon. Daniel had spent 20 years as an Indian agent before retiring, and if anyone could help Henry understand the bigger picture, it would be him. The familiar sounds of piano music and clinking glasses provided cover for their hushed conversation. "They're trying to provoke an incident, Henry," Daniel explained grimly, his weathered face illuminated by lamplight. "Robert Walker over at the territorial office let slip that there's a consortium of wealthy Easterners buying up land options all through the valley. They're counting on the tribes responding violently to the desecration. Then the army moves in, the natives get relocated, and suddenly all that worthless land becomes prime railroad property." Henry's fingers tightened around his whiskey glass as memories of his father's stories came flooding back. The elder Anderson had witnessed similar schemes play out in Kansas, watching helplessly as corrupt officials manufactured conflicts to justify land grabs. Now history was preparing to repeat itself, with Henry holding a position that made him complicit unless he acted. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Margaret Moore, the quiet but sharp-minded telegrapher who ran the Cheyenne office, pulled Henry aside as he passed her station. She'd been intercepting coded messages between Frank Taylor and certain powerful figures back east, communications that outlined the full scope of their plan. Her face was drawn with worry as she shared what she'd learned. "They're not just after the valley, Henry. The whole operation extends up through Deadwood, thousands of acres. And Frank's brother Charlie is already recruiting hired guns down in El Paso. They're preparing for violence, counting on it even." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she handed him a stack of decoded telegrams, each one more damning than the last. Susan Walker, Robert's wife, and the territory's most respected newspaper publisher, proved another unexpected source of support. When Henry brought her evidence of the conspiracy, she immediately grasped the broader implications. "This isn't just about land," she said, poring over Margaret's decoded messages. "They're trying to trigger a wider conflict that will let them reshape the entire territory." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Frank Taylor's weekly surveying rides weren't about mapping train routes. He was coordinating with hired agitators to stir up tensions along the reservation boundaries. The construction schedule had been carefully planned to begin work on the burial grounds just as the tribes gathered for important seasonal ceremonies. Henry found himself walking a dangerous line, maintaining his role as a loyal company man while secretly gathering evidence and building a network of allies. He took to meeting Daniel Clark late at night, in the back room of Martha Taylor's boarding house, the widow's discretion assured by her own bitter history with Frank's family and their corrupt dealings. The situation grew more complex when Rachel Anderson, Henry's younger sister, arrived unexpectedly from Dodge City. She'd fled her position as a schoolteacher after uncovering similar schemes being orchestrated by the same Eastern consortium. Her presence added personal stakes to Henry's mounting moral crisis. This wasn't just about protecting distant tribes anymore, but defending his own family from powerful enemies. Laura Clark, Daniel's daughter who worked as a nurse at the Indian Agency, brought reports of increasing unrest among the tribes. The elders sensed the coming storm but counseled patience, even as younger warriors argued for preemptive action. The railroad's provocations were having their intended effect, pushing both sides closer to the brink of violence. Each day brought new challenges as Henry tried to subtly delay the construction timeline without arousing suspicion. He redirected survey teams, lost critical supplies, and found endless technical issues that required consultation with distant experts. But Frank Taylor was growing suspicious, and Henry knew his window of opportunity was closing fast. The spring rains had turned the construction site into a quagmire, buying Henry precious time as wagons struggled through the thick mud. But he knew this respite was temporary. Through his office window, he watched Frank Taylor's distinctive black coat moving between the worker camps, no doubt gathering intelligence on the delays. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy expanse, where teams of laborers worked to lay ties across land that should have remained untouched. Laura's latest visit had brought more troubling news. The Indian Agency's supplies were being mysteriously delayed or redirected, leaving many families without promised provisions. It was a calculated move to increase desperation among the tribes, another piece in the consortium's elaborate chess game. Henry had seen similar tactics during his years working the railroads. Create impossible conditions, then blame the victims when violence erupted. In Cheyenne, Margaret was making progress uncovering the paper trail that connected the railroad's board members to land speculation schemes along the proposed route. Her teaching position provided cover as she carefully documented how certain investors had purchased properties suspiciously close to where sacred burial grounds were located. But her inquiries hadn't gone unnoticed. Twice now, she'd spotted the same two men watching her movements around town. Charlie, Henry's most trusted foreman, had begun quietly spreading word among sympathetic workers about the true nature of their project. Many of the Irish and Chinese laborers had their own bitter experiences with powerful interests stealing land from the vulnerable. Small acts of resistance multiplied. Equipment maintenance took longer, surveying calculations needed frequent double-checking, supply inventories became confused. The situation grew more complex when Daniel arrived unexpectedly from Dodge City, bringing word that similar railroad schemes were unfolding across multiple territories. The Eastern Consortium was playing a much larger game than Henry had initially realized. They weren't just after this particular stretch of land. They were orchestrating a coordinated campaign to trigger widespread unrest that would justify military intervention across the entire frontier. During a tense midnight meeting in Henry's cabin, Laura revealed that several tribal elders had approached her with a desperate proposal. If the railroad would agree to slight adjustments to the route, just a few miles north, they would grant right-of-way through other tribal lands. It was a reasonable compromise that could prevent bloodshed, but Henry knew Frank Taylor would never accept it. The consortium wanted conflict, not resolution. The spring storms intensified, and with them came increasing pressure from company headquarters demanding explanations for the delays. Henry's carefully crafted technical excuses were wearing thin. Frank had begun sending daily telegrams to the board in El Paso, and rumors circulated that special investigators were being dispatched to assess the situation. Time was running out for subtle resistance. Margaret's research had revealed an unexpected ally. Robert Williams, a junior partner in the railroad's law firm who had grown increasingly troubled by the consortium's methods. Through carefully arranged meetings in the back room of Cheyenne's Silver Dollar Saloon, he provided documents proving the company had deliberately falsified surveys to ensure the route would cross burial grounds, despite viable alternatives existing. The situation reached a critical point when a group of young warriors, frustrated by the continuing desecration of their ancestors' graves, raided a supply wagon. Though no one was harmed, Frank Taylor seized on the incident, sending inflammatory reports to both the military and newspapers. Henry knew this was exactly the kind of spark the consortium had been waiting for. Unless he acted decisively, events would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. As summer approached, bringing drier weather that would allow construction to accelerate, Henry faced an impossible choice. He could continue his increasingly futile efforts at delay and misdirection, or he could take dramatic action that would expose the conspiracy but certainly end his career and possibly put his family in danger. The weight of this decision pressed down on him as he watched another sunrise illuminate the sacred lands his company was determined to destroy. The summer sun beat mercilessly on Henry Anderson's shoulders as he stood at the edge of the railway cut, watching his work crews blast through another section of limestone. The acrid smell of black powder hung in the air, mingling with dust, and the earthy scent of freshly exposed rock. As construction supervisor for the Western Pacific Railroad's expansion through Wyoming Territory, he'd overseen countless such operations, but something about this site near Cheyenne made his skin crawl. Frank Taylor, his trusted foreman, approached with a concerned look etched across his weathered face. "Mr. Anderson, we found more of them bones while clearing the new section. And those carvings too, just like the others." He pulled a fragment of decorated pottery from his vest pocket, the worn design still visible despite centuries buried in the earth. Henry's heart sank as he examined the artifact, knowing full well what it meant. The discovery confirmed his growing suspicions about the route change ordered by Robert Clark, the railroad's regional director. The original survey had plotted a course 5 miles north, following the natural contours of the land. But Clark had insisted on this new alignment, claiming it would save time and money. Now Henry understood the real reason. They were deliberately cutting through sacred Cheyenne burial grounds. That evening in his office tent, Henry pored over the survey maps by lamplight, tracing the old route and the new one with a trembling finger. The relocated line created a provocative slash through lands the tribes had specifically protected in their treaties. His mind wandered to the conversation he'd overheard between Clark and Daniel Moore, the territory's newly appointed Indian agent, discussing how regrettable incidents might necessitate a stronger military presence. Charlie Walker, the company's chief engineer, entered without knocking, his usual confident manner subdued. "Just got word from the Cheyenne camp downriver," he said quietly. "Their council is meeting tonight. The medicine man says we've desecrated their ancestors' resting place. They're talking about war." Henry nodded grimly, having expected this, but the confirmation still chilled him to the bone. Margaret Clark, Robert's wife, had warned Henry weeks ago about her husband's scheming with land speculators and military contractors. Over tea in their Cheyenne mansion, she'd confided her horror at learning of plans to deliberately incite violence that would justify seizing vast tracts of tribal territory. Now her words echoed in Henry's mind as he confronted the evidence of that conspiracy. Rachel Taylor, Frank's daughter who served as the camp's nurse, burst into the tent. "The Walker boy's been taken," she cried. "Susan Walker rode out to the trading post and never came back. Charlie just found her horse, spooked and riderless." Henry knew this was exactly the kind of incident Clark and his conspirators had been waiting for. But something about it felt wrong, staged perhaps. As the camp erupted in panic, Henry noticed Daniel Moore's men distributing rifles with suspicious efficiency, almost as if they'd been prepared for this moment. The Indian agent was already drafting telegrams to the War Department, calling for immediate military intervention. But Henry had seen Susan Walker speaking with Moore just that morning, their manner far too familiar for strangers. Laura Anderson, Henry's wife, appeared at his tent flap, her face pale but determined. "I followed Susan earlier," she whispered. "She rode straight to the Indian camp and went inside Chief Grey Wolf's lodge willingly. This is no kidnapping. It's a ruse to start a war." Henry kissed her forehead, grateful once again for her keen eye and quick wit. The next hours passed in a blur of activity as Henry gathered his most trusted workers. Frank Taylor organized a small group to secure the powder magazine and tool stores, ensuring they couldn't be used for violence. Charlie Walker, learning of his sister's willing departure, joined their effort to prevent the coming catastrophe. But time was running desperately short. Robert Clark arrived at sunset with a contingent of armed men, ordering the camp to prepare for defensive action. His carefully controlled mask slipped when Henry confronted him with evidence of the staged kidnapping. "You fool!" Clark snarled. "Do you know how much these lands are worth? The coal seams alone would make us millions. A few dead Indians is a small price to pay." In that moment, Henry's choice became crystal clear. 20 years of railroad work, the wealth and status he'd accumulated, his carefully cultivated connections, all of it meant nothing compared to preventing the slaughter of innocent people. He gave the signal, and Frank's men moved to surround Clark's group while Charlie Walker rode for the fort with proof of the conspiracy. Martha Moore, the Indian agent's wife, proved an unexpected ally, arriving with documents she'd stolen from her husband's office detailing the entire scheme. The papers showed how Clark, Moore, and others had orchestrated events to trigger military intervention, complete with maps marking tribal lands they planned to seize once the natives were eliminated or relocated. Throughout the night, Henry worked feverishly to prevent violence from erupting. Rachel Taylor rode to the Indian camp with Laura Anderson, explaining the plot to Chief Grey Wolf and proving that Susan Walker was a willing messenger, not a victim. The chief's warriors stood ready to defend their sacred grounds, but held back when they understood that not all the white men supported the conspirators' plans. As dawn broke over the river valley, military investigators arrived from Fort Laramie, summoned by Charlie Walker's evidence. Robert Clark and Daniel Moore were taken into custody, their carefully laid plans in ruins. Henry watched them led away in irons, knowing his own career with the railroad was likely over, but feeling lighter than he had in months. The railway's board of directors ultimately approved the original northern route, and Henry supervised the removal of tracks from the burial grounds, working alongside Cheyenne holy men to ensure their ancestors' rest remained undisturbed. The incident marked a turning point in relations between the railroad and the tribes, proving that honor and justice could triumph over greed and deception. As summer turned to autumn, Henry found himself overseeing a very different kind of railroad project. The new northern route required innovative engineering solutions to cross the challenging terrain, but the extra effort and expense proved worthwhile. Working alongside Cheyenne scouts who knew the land intimately, his crews discovered more stable ground for the railbeds and natural passes through the hills that the original surveys had missed. Margaret, who had stood by Henry through the tumultuous events, helped establish a trading post at the new construction camp. She employed several Cheyenne women to make blankets and clothing for the workers, creating an unexpected bridge between the two communities. The sound of traditional looms clicking alongside the rhythm of rail hammers became a familiar melody in the camp. Charlie Walker's reputation grew among both settlers and tribes as word spread of his role in exposing the conspiracy. Though offered a prestigious position in Cheyenne's territorial office, he chose to remain as liaison between the railroad and tribal councils, believing he could do more good in the field than behind a desk. His sister Susan continued her work as a translator, earning the respect of both communities. The autumn winds brought unexpected visitors to the camp. Frank, Henry's former assistant, who had fled during the crisis, returned to face the consequences of his actions. Rather than turn him over to the authorities, Henry assigned him the humbling task of helping restore the disturbed burial grounds under the guidance of tribal elders. The experience transformed Frank, who found purpose in making amends. Rachel, the schoolteacher from Deadwood who had first raised concerns about the original route, established a unique educational program where railroad workers' children learned alongside Cheyenne youth. The school became a model for other communities along the expanding rail line, proving that progress didn't have to come at the cost of cultural destruction. As winter approached, Henry received word that Robert Clark and Daniel Moore faced trial in Cheyenne. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including detailed documentation of their scheme to profit from the planned military intervention. Their conviction sent a clear message throughout the territory that the old ways of doing business through deception and force were no longer acceptable. The new year brought both challenges and opportunities. Martha, a widow who ran the camp's medical station, began incorporating traditional Cheyenne healing practices alongside Western medicine, creating an unexpected synthesis that benefited everyone. Her success sparked similar initiatives at other railroad camps along the river. Laura, the telegraph operator who had helped expose the conspiracy by intercepting coded messages, established a network of communications hubs that served both railroad and tribal needs. The system helped prevent misunderstandings and facilitated trade, proving that technology could unite rather than divide communities when properly managed. By spring, the railroad's new route was well established, and something remarkable had occurred. The construction camps, once symbols of conflict, had evolved into thriving trading posts where cultures met and merged. Henry's decision to stand against injustice had not only prevented a massacre, but had inadvertently created a model for peaceful coexistence. The tribal elders, seeing the positive changes, shared ancient stories of the land with the railroad surveyors, helping them understand and work with the natural flow of the terrain. This knowledge proved invaluable as the line pushed westward, resulting in a more efficient and harmonious path through the territory. As Henry stood watching the first train roll through on the completed northern route, he reflected on how close they had come to tragedy. The gleaming rails no longer represented just progress and profit, but a path forward built on mutual respect and understanding. The sacred burial grounds remained undisturbed, protected now by both tribal and territorial law, a testament to the power of choosing right over expedience. The legacy of those turbulent days lived on in unexpected ways. The trading posts along the new route became gathering places where stories were shared, traditions honored, and new possibilities imagined. Henry's stand against injustice had not only prevented a war, but had helped forge a different kind of future for the territory, one built on cooperation rather than conquest. Henry Anderson stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the winding riverbank, where the railroad crews worked tirelessly below. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the sacred burial mounds that would soon be destroyed by the advancing steel rails. His weathered hands trembled as he read the telegram from company headquarters in Cheyenne one final time. Explicit orders to continue construction through the burial grounds, despite his urgent warnings about the devastating consequences. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like the heavy iron rails his men laid each day. After 20 years supervising railroad expansion across the frontier, Henry had never faced such a moral crisis. The tribal elders had pleaded with him, explaining how their ancestors had been buried in these hills for countless generations. But Frank Taylor, his superior in Cheyenne, had made it crystal clear. Any delay would result in Henry's immediate termination. Susan Clark, the local schoolteacher who had been documenting the tribal histories, approached Henry as he continued staring at the construction below. "They're doing this deliberately," she said quietly. "I found evidence in the survey reports. They knew about these burial grounds months ago. They want to provoke the tribes into retaliation so the army will have an excuse to drive them out completely." Her words confirmed Henry's darkest suspicions. That evening, in the crowded dining room of the River Junction Hotel, Henry observed Frank Taylor holding court with Daniel Moore, the territorial marshal, and several other officials. They spoke in hushed tones about troop movements and containing the Indian problem. Henry's stomach churned as he realized how deep the conspiracy went. His own role in this impending tragedy could no longer be ignored. Through careful investigation, Henry and Susan had discovered that Rachel Walker, the governor's wife, was secretly buying up huge tracts of land along the proposed railroad route through tribal territories. Her husband, Robert Walker, would ensure military support once conflicts erupted. The pieces of this cruel puzzle were falling into place, revealing a carefully orchestrated plan to steal the last remaining tribal lands. Under cover of darkness, Henry met with Charlie Moore, Daniel's younger brother who served as a cavalry scout. Charlie had grown up among the tribes and still maintained close ties with many families. "They're planning to scatter the burial remains," Charlie whispered. "Make it look like tribal vandalism to justify a military response. But I've warned as many people as I can to be ready to evacuate when the time comes." The next morning, Henry gathered his construction crews and announced an immediate work stoppage, citing dangerous ground conditions that would require extensive surveys. Frank Taylor arrived within hours, face red with fury as he threatened to have Henry arrested for breach of contract. But Henry stood his ground, knowing that each day of delay gave more families time to escape the coming storm. Susan had been secretly documenting everything: the falsified surveys, the land speculation schemes, the military collusion. With Charlie's help, she managed to get her evidence to sympathetic newspaper editors in both Deadwood and El Paso. The story of corruption and conspiracy began spreading across the frontier like a prairie fire. When the first articles appeared, Rachel Walker quickly sold her land holdings and fled to Europe. Governor Walker found himself facing a federal investigation. Frank Taylor attempted to destroy incriminating documents, but Henry had already secured copies. The carefully laid plans for profit through bloodshed began crumbling as public outrage grew. Through careful negotiation, tribal leaders and railroad officials eventually agreed on an alternate route that would preserve the sacred burial grounds. Henry lost his position but gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that he had helped prevent a massacre. Susan's detailed accounts were published as a book that exposed the darker side of Western expansion. Charlie Moore went on to serve as a liaison between tribal nations and the railroad, ensuring that future development respected sacred lands. Daniel Moore resigned his marshal's position in shame when his involvement was revealed. The conspiracy had been thwarted, but Henry knew similar schemes would continue as long as greed drove the relentless march of progress across the frontier. Years later, Henry would often visit the preserved burial grounds with his grandchildren, teaching them about the importance of standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. The old burial mounds remained undisturbed, a testament to the power of conscience over corruption. The railroad still brought change to the frontier, but not at the expense of human dignity and sacred heritage. As autumn painted the frontier in amber and gold, Henry found himself increasingly called upon to mediate disputes between the expanding railroads and tribal nations. His reputation for fairness and integrity had spread beyond the initial conflict, drawing him into negotiations across the territories. From his modest cabin near the river crossing outside Cheyenne, he maintained correspondence with both railroad executives and tribal leaders, carefully building bridges of understanding between worlds that seemed destined for endless conflict. One crisp morning, A letter arrived from Susan, now working as a respected journalist in Dodge City. She wrote of similar schemes being uncovered in other territories, but also of growing public awareness and resistance to such tactics. Her book had sparked a movement among younger railroad officials who sought more ethical approaches to expansion. Henry smiled as he read how several companies had begun hiring tribal consultants to help plan routes that respected sacred lands while still serving commercial needs. Charlie Moore's work as a liaison had proven particularly effective in the region between Deadwood and Cheyenne. His understanding of both railroad operations and tribal customs allowed him to propose innovative solutions that satisfied all parties. The modified rail routes sometimes took longer to construct and cost more initially, but the lasting peace and cooperation they facilitated proved far more valuable than the short-term profits of the original corrupt plans. Margaret, who had supported Henry through the darkest days of the conflict, now ran a successful trading post that served as an informal gathering place for both settlers and tribal members. Her fair business practices and genuine respect for all customers helped ease tensions in the community. She and Henry had married the previous spring, their shared commitment to justice having blossomed into something deeper. Robert, the former company executive who had initially hired Henry, eventually came forward with additional evidence about similar conspiracies, leading to investigations that prevented several other planned provocations. Though his career in the railroad industry was finished, he found purpose in working with reform-minded business leaders to develop more ethical approaches to Western development. Rachel, the tribal elder's daughter who had first alerted Henry to the sacred nature of the burial grounds, became an influential voice for her people. She traveled between settlements, sharing her people's history and traditions with settlers willing to listen. Her efforts helped humanize the tribes in the eyes of many who had previously seen them only as obstacles to progress. The river that had once served as a natural boundary between worlds now became a symbol of connection. Trading posts and meeting places sprang up along its banks, where people from different backgrounds found common ground in commerce and conversation. Henry often observed these interactions from the porch of Margaret's trading post, noting how the children of settlers and tribal families played together without the prejudices of their elders. Laura, Henry's eldest granddaughter, grew up listening to stories of the burial ground conflict while sitting on his knee. She eventually became a teacher in Cheyenne, ensuring that future generations understood both the darker chapters of Western expansion and the importance of standing firm against injustice. Her classroom featured maps showing both the railroad routes and the sacred sites, teaching students that progress and respect could coexist. Martha, the widow whose initial tip had helped expose Daniel Moore's corruption, transformed her small farm into a way station where travelers from all backgrounds could find rest and honest conversation. Her kitchen table became famous as a place where differences could be discussed and understood, if not always resolved. As the years passed, the burial grounds remained untouched, marked now by a simple monument that told their story to passing travelers. The railroad tracks that curved respectfully around the sacred site served as a daily reminder that different paths could be found when people of conscience stood together against greed and hatred. Henry's grandchildren would often bring fresh flowers to the monument, carrying on the legacy of respect and understanding that their grandfather had helped establish. The frontier continued its transformation, but in this corner of the territory at least, change came with greater wisdom and compassion. Henry's final years were spent watching a new generation learn to balance progress with preservation, finding ways to honor both the future and the past. His story became part of local legend, whispered around campfires and taught in schoolrooms, a testament to the power of one person's choice to stand for what was right, no matter the cost.